Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. This is an informational and input meeting concerning valet fee revisions that are being proposed by Metro Public Works. To kick us off this afternoon, I'd like to turn the program over to Councilman Freddie O'Connell, who represents District 19, encompassing downtown. He's shown tremendous leadership on this issue, and I'd like to have him welcome us in this afternoon.
Great, thanks, Jeff, and thank you to all. I know this has been a collaborative effort in the Metro Public Works Department, and we've had a lot of staff attention to this. Just by way of some background, I'm in my second term representing District 19, which encompasses all of downtown, the Gulch, a healthy chunk of Midtown, and several of the urban neighborhoods, primarily to the north and south of our urban core. So this is an area that sees a lot of valet stand usage. So I was aware of this issue term. This term, after being reelected in fall of 2019, I was elected to Council's Traffic, Parking, and Transportation Committee. This is one of two kind of elected committee chairs that puts council members also on commissions, the other being planning. But after that, I joined the Traffic and Parking Commission, which is staffed by the Metro Public Works Department. Not long after I joined, Chairman John Green, who is the longstanding commission member and chair, I think, in hopes of digesting some of the conversation that had been prompted by a long and somewhat controversial discussion about parking modernization, began taking commissioners through sort of what it is we are chartered and what authorities we have under the Metro Code of Law to begin working on. So we examined a few things, including valet. The valet permit process I had already known to be somewhat outdated, but we learned a lot in reviewing with staff exactly what some of our existing constraints are, right? We had seen, for instance, several redevelopment projects that removed metered parking from streetscapes where there was no use of an existing power for reclaiming that revenue, right? That we had never yet employed a power of the commission to basically try to say, okay, we just took away some metered parking space and we have not accounted for the loss of that curb valuation through the deployment of a valet stand. Further, our valet fee itself had not advanced in, I believe it's decades, if I'm looking at the last time it was updated since introduction in, I believe, the 90s. So it is $50 per year right now for an annual permit that can be renewed in perpetuity. So we had a few different things we needed to look at to try to just understand the impact. I mean, some of this is really just a long-running curb management exploration and looking at the market of curb space as a public asset that can and should be used for scenarios like valet. But at our charge, at the commission's charge after reviewing that, staff undertook a several-month examination of what policies might be a better practice for Nashville and brought that back to the commission a few months ago. I think many commissioners, including myself, had heard from a bunch of key stakeholders. We did not want this into practice as a policy without some public input and probably just generally taking into account the economic impact of COVID-19 on our hospitality industry, including both lodging and restaurants, as well as bars, that imposing an increase of any kind in the near term, we should probably look at when the appropriate time to kind of start implementing any revisions that people thought were worthwhile going forward. So that's sort of the backdrop here. Today's conversation is going to have Public Works staff lead us through a discussion about the proposed revisions, and then we will look at a public input portion of this meeting as well. So, Jeff, thanks for the address, and I will hand it back to you for a presentation.
Well, thank you, Councilman. Again, appreciate your assistance in pushing us forward on this very important topic. Just a little bit about the run of the show this afternoon. I will go through, I've only got about a dozen slides, and I will be summarizing a draft policy document that is available online. If you go to Metro's Traffic and Parking Commission page, you can find that there. And so I will be summarizing all the information I present tonight will be coming from that document and the information that's included there. And then we'll open it up to question and answer. You'll be able to ask questions verbally through the phone, and Mr. Buchanan with Metro ITS will be assisting us with that. You can also, as we go through this, the question hits you, go ahead and type it in the chat box. If you know how to use that here on WebEx, feel free to type that, and we will have those read, and we'll maybe take turns going back and forth with some verbal and some written questions, depending on how that goes. Assisting me this afternoon are Ms. Diane Marshall, who is our parking manager at Metro Public Works, and Sissy Miro Juarez, who will be helping us with the Q&A when we get to the latter parts of the meeting. With that, I'll go ahead and I'm going to use some slides here. I hope everyone can see these. So a little bit of background, as Councilman O'Connell alluded to, there is a lot of background here. This is a long standing issue that the commission has been trying to tackle and make progress on. I think everyone is probably familiar. If you're attending this meeting, you probably have some familiarity with our valet process. But if not, we are governed by the Traffic and Parking Commission, which is an appointed board here in Metro that looks at things like on-street parking, valet zones, loading zones, as well as a number of other regulatory traffic issues around the city. Going back to the fall of 2019, they began in earnest asking for some information related to our valet fee. I would pause there to say we know that this is not the only issue in our valet process that needs attention. As was alluded to, our applications, things like online payment, all of these things are things that we're working on. But for the sake of this process and tonight's discussion, we are limiting that to the valet fee itself. Not only that, but we know that there are other issues outside of the valet world, things like our bag meter policy on making those reservations, and other things that again continue to have needs for some modernization. I'll talk more about that in just a second. After that request in fall of 2019, we did develop a draft form of the policy we'll be discussing this afternoon. It has gone into some iterations based largely on input that was gathered from use of a focus group. And I won't name all of those individuals specifically here. They are in that document. We appreciate their help very much. I will recognize one of those members, Councilman Sean Parker of District 5, sat on that committee and was very helpful as well, and we appreciate his assistance in that. The focus group did provide some very helpful input that came up with some significant changes to the policy that we had drafted earlier, so that was revised last November. We presented this to the commission in December, and coming out of the focus group and the input that we had, the commission was very aware that this had not had a lot of public input. There was some, because of our focus group members represented constituencies that were very keen on this issue, but it was at their commission's request that this meeting is happening tonight, and then we will present the results of tonight's meeting and subsequent input that comes as a matter of this back to the commission at its next meeting, second week of March. So that's in a nutshell some of that background that was referred to earlier. On the right there, you see just some information related to our valet zone request. One thing that we've heard as we presented this to the commission in December was that this is really a tough time to be thinking about valet fee changes, and we agree. We've all been through a tremendously difficult period in 2020, and I can't even begin to talk about this the way our downtown business owners and operators can, as well as our parking managers there. So you see some of the numbers there. We still did have some new applications come in 2020, not nearly as many as we have in the past, but I just wanted to present that information to you on what our relative attention to this issue has been. You saw a big gap in that last slide from February to September, and I assure you it wasn't because there was nothing happening. One of the things that we've had to pay careful attention to is some of the other ongoing efforts in not only the parking, but to broaden that out a little bit and call it the curb management world. We have coming very soon, we'll be undertaking a smart loading zone pilot, which will be operated by a company called Cord, who has done this in other cities, trying to make the best use of our loading zones, which are tremendous resources in downtown particularly. We also have a smart parking RFP, which will be kind of another look at how do we modernize the on-street parking system in Nashville. Again, we know there are issues in terms of enforcement, setting those meter rates, collecting on ticket infractions and things like that. And so that RFP will be coming and will help in that. And then perhaps the broadest of all, trying to consider, well, what should be parking and what should be loading and what should be valet anyway. And not only that, but what about bike lanes? What about transit service? What about ride share and scooters? All of these things are tremendous users of our curbs. And so we've seen here in Nashville, as cities have around the country, tremendous demand for curbside resources, because it is arguably the most valuable resource in any city is what happens at that curb. And so the management plan is scheduled to get underway later this year, and will help begin giving us some guidance on how we're making these decisions at a citywide level. And of course, all of this falls under the umbrella of the new city transportation plan that was adopted just a few months ago. And so there's a lot of other activity happening. And I guess I would say this about tonight's meeting and what we're doing here with the valet policy. If we make decisions tonight and in the months ahead and change the way these fees are structured, you'll have to forgive us if, within a year, we're kind of re-looking at it again. That's just sort of the nature of how much activity is happening in this area. We did want to go ahead because it has been so long since we looked at this and begin making some changes. But in a way, we're thinking about this as somewhat of a stopgap while some of these other smart parking initiatives are under development. So getting to the nuts and bolts of the revised fee policy, we are governed by Metro Code in this area, in Chapter 12, which deals with valet parking operations. And more specifically, you have the code there, and it's in parts A, B, C, D, E, and F. And the most important to us, germane to the discussion this afternoon, is Subpart C, which says the fee for a valet parking permit shall be $50 plus revenue lost annually for each required metered space as measured by the hourly rate for each metered space. All fees are payable in advance. And so that's what we use to set our parking rate, and that sounds pretty straightforward. And the $50 we've got down. There's no problem there. The problem becomes, to advance this statement here, which is We are asked by code required to charge revenue lost annually for each metered space. And so what we have tried to do working with our focus group is unpack that definition. It sounds clear, but as we get into it, it presents a number of questions for us. And so what we have done, what the document does and what our effort does is to try and define, well, what exactly is the revenue lost annually so that we can have the appropriate fee set for use of the street in the form of valet spaces. As I'll go through this afternoon, there's two aspects to it generally. There's a cost calculation when we try to define the revenue that's lost, and there's an applicability question there that we'll cover here first. We'll start with the cost calculation, and we'll start with a formula here that only an engineer could love, I suppose. It looks menacing, but we'll walk through it, and hopefully it will make sense. So the $50, as I said, that's the easy part. The second part defines that revenue that's lost annually, and we've broken that out into three parts. You see the first part starts with 35%, and then a 50%, and then 100%. What each of those parts does is to assign a value to the spaces that are being requested based on how many spaces are being requested. The code, we didn't see this, but in subparts A and B, it talks about these things. The default request for a valet space is 2 spaces. That's about 50 feet of curbside. And that's typically where we start. But it goes on to talk about that a business can request more, and our staff looks at that and determines whether that's an appropriate request, whether it presents any traffic issues or anything like that. So in effect, you can kind of request whatever you want to. And in some cases, that is what has been happening. We've got valet space, we got valet zones that range from 2 spaces all the way up to, I think the highest is 8. And so that's a very large outlay of curbside. And so what this formula does is it says for the first 2 spaces, we're going to charge you a rate of 35% of the potential value of those spaces. Okay, for the second 2, say you want 4 spaces. The first 2 will be at the 35% rate. The other 2 would be at a 50% rate. And then if you want any more than 4, everything above that would be at 100% of the full value of each metered space. Well, what's the full value of each metered space? That's these other terms here. T, which is the number of hours in the week that you want to use that space. And then R is just the parking rate, whether you're in the central business district or outside of the central business district, each of those having 2 different hourly rates as set by the Traffic and Parking Commission. So T might be the most important thing there. It's important to know that we're only talking about time periods when our meters are in service. If you're requesting a valet zone that doesn't start until 6 p.m., T in that case is 0, and so your valet fee would only be $50 for the year. I don't think that's perfect. I think there's probably room even there to improve, to appropriately value that curb space outside of the metered times. But that's how this would work. Would be just to keep in mind, it's only during metered times. Sunday is not a meter time. So if you want valet activity on Sundays, that also would not incur any additional costs. There may be questions here. We'll move on, but we'll be glad to come back and explain that more if we need to. We do have on this next slide some examples, and these are in the document as well. We thought it might be helpful to kind of get a sense of how this works. So you have here 4 different hypotheticals. A restaurant in Midtown that only operates 6 to midnight, kind of like I just described, would only be $50. If they want to operate from a downtown restaurant with a 2-space valet operating during evening hours, but only towards the weekend, shows you how you would actually calculate that. In that case, they would have about a $500 fee. I won't go through all of those. There's a just not an infinite, but a very large number of examples we could go through there. and folks may have questions about what theirs would be, and we can help do that. I don't know that on the call tonight we're going to run through these calculations, but to give you some idea for how these fees are shaking out, we have 54 valet locations. The highest one would incur a high rate of $38,300. Of those 54, about 10% of those have costs that are higher than $30,000 for the year. No question, that's a lot of money, and we don't take that lightly at all. But the reason those are incurring such high cost is those are high numbers of spaces, like 6 to 8 spaces, and almost in every case, probably in every case, to get that high, you have to be operating 24 hours a day. So we see things like hotels, racking up those higher numbers, mainly because they are 24 hours a day. And we understand fully that that's kind of the business model for many hotels in downtown. You have to operate, you need that space 24 hours a day, and you have to operate that way. So we get that. The lowest, of course, is 0. We have plenty that have valets only outside of metered times. I shouldn't say 0. I guess I should say $50. But this is the revenue loss part of that equation. And 14 of those 54, I guess that'd be roughly 20%, maybe a little more, are less than $1,000. So, and then the average of the 54 are about just under $9,500. So we look at that to try and truth that a little bit, to say, is this a reasonable cost or not? As we set that, there was more that went into it than just kind of a thumb in the air saying that sounds good, or no, it should be a little more or a little less. We actually looked at some peer reviews of I think about 6 other cities, and looked at how their fees are structured. That was very informative, and looked at some of the meter revenues that we have in Nashville now. So all of those helped inform the development of that equation. So moving on to the applicability aspect of it, this does not apply to everyone. It's very important to know that too. And so all of that equation that we just went through, depending on where you are in the city, may not even be applicable. That's what this section is all about. And so there's 3 aspects to whether or not the parking revenue calculation would apply to you. Again, always thinking about what is the cost to Metro that we are trying to capture. What is the lost revenue here? So there's 3 aspects: the geography, where are you, the configuration of your valet space, and the presence of any meters, whether those are there or not. And so on the map here, these are our metered areas. You have the CBD, which is the Central Business District area that has the higher meter rate. And then outside of that, you have the non-CBD, which encompasses Midtown and the Vanderbilt area and Hillsborough Village areas and others that have a lower parking rate. If you're in areas like Germantown or 12 South, and we have applications for valet areas, those would be outside, and so there's no meter revenue to be lost there. So again, those would only incur the $50 fee. That's the geography component of that consideration. The configuration part looks like this, and these sketches, they may not be the best. Hopefully they get the point across. They are in the document as well, but there are 4 of them that are given as examples. And so in configuration 1 to the left, that's probably the most standard valet zone that we have in the city today. And so the little clear boxes above and below the hatched area represent parked cars. So this would be like on a street that has on-street parking now, and what the valet request does is to come in and remove some of that parking, or what is potential parking. Maybe it doesn't literally remove meters, but the potential is there for that metered space in deference to valet parking activity. That does apply, and that's really the configuration that this policy is being developed for. You might have something similar where there's on-street parking on the street in configuration number 2, and maybe under a development or just a repurpose of the curb, there's actually a cutout into that sidewalk to try and create more space for the valet area. That may be well and good, but it does still displace some on-street parking or potential on-street parking, and so that would apply as well. Similar to that, though, is configure 3, where a developer, say, builds a new building and incorporates that cutout, but there was never any parking on the street to begin with. And so what this does is introduces a valet area, but it does so in such a way that it does not preclude parking that would have been there. So in this case, we would say that the lost revenue fee does not apply because there was never any revenue there to be lost in the first place. And then somewhat similar to that would be configuration 4. This is just a little bit to be comprehensive. This is where you might actually build a larger version of that. We've seen some of this happen on 8th Avenue and other places where a larger hotel, say, is built and has more off-street valet. In most cases, that's off the right-of-way anyway, and so that doesn't apply. But anyway, just for comprehensiveness, showing that in here that generally would not apply to this this parking this valet calculation either. The last thing is the presence of meters. And so again, in keeping with the ideal of code, which says we will charge for lost revenue, and trying to define when did we have revenue and when did we not. We've tried to develop, let me just put it this way to you and tell you the intent. The intent is that when we're working on the street that, or a valet is requested on a street that has meters on some part of that street, then this would apply. You see the map, and I put that there again because obviously not every street in those colored areas has on-street parking, or at least metered on-street parking. And so when it does not, and then if a valet is requested on one of those streets, what we contend is that there's no parking revenue there to be lost, and so that fee would not apply either. So if these are the streets that at the time had parking, we've already heard some input, which was very appreciated, saying you may need to check 1 or 2 of these streets, make sure that parking still exists or existed at the time and so forth. So we will certainly do that, but that's the intent, to only make this apply where there is on-street parking currently, metered on-street parking. That's all I wanted to get through. I know that was quick. I hope that was a adequate summary, enough to kind of tickle some questions from you. Before I stop and we do see if there are questions, I want to be sure to kind of provide a next step here. As I mentioned, we will be going back to the Traffic and Parking Commission in March. And what the commission, I think, is hoping to hear is from you all who are most affected by this. Any comments that you have, and certainly any questions, we want to make sure that those are answered in advance of that meeting. So I've put my name and contact here at the bottom, and also that of Diane Marshall, again, our parking manager. Please let us hear from you as you have a chance to pull that document, digest it a little bit. Maybe you've already done that, maybe you haven't. But if you're interested in this topic and want to take time to do that, we would certainly be glad to handle any questions that you might have. And then if you just want to lodge comments, we'll be glad to accept those too, and make those available to our traffic and parking commissioners. With that, Sissy, why don't we start with you? Are there any questions in the Q&A box for us this afternoon?
Hey, Jeff, no, right now there are no questions up, but here comes one. Okay, so we've got a question here. Would these apply to nonprofits or valet use? Let's see, it disappeared on me. Let me see if I can get it back. Oh, here we go. they're coming in so quickly. My screen is not cooperating with me here.
Sissy, I was able to use the drag bar separating the participants in the Q&A to get some more space for the Q&A.
Okay, let's see. Okay. Would these apply to nonprofits or valet use for charity events? It's from Denise Minatoya.
Okay, that's a good question, and I'm going to ask Diane Marshall to kind of be on standby here in case I botch this one. This is kind of a detail here. One of the key words that I heard there was events, and so I'm thinking that's kind of a 1 day or a short term. We do have temporary valet permits for special events that we issue. This would not apply to those in general. We haven't really discussed much the fee strategy for any special events. That would not change at this time, and so it would not affect that. But as far as if there are nonprofits and a valet is desired at a nonprofit, I'm not sure how common that is. I don't think we have typically waived those fees. I guess this brings up kind of a good issue or a good point to make here, in that if these changes are adopted by the Traffic and Parking Commission, and we begin to develop that new fee strategy, what we anticipate will happen is that some folks may relook at their valet. They may say, I don't need as many spaces as I've got on the books, or I could move it and shave an hour off here or there and save some costs that way. We expect, or maybe two or more merge and can operate out of one. We don't know, but we expect some of that may happen. Even if it doesn't, my point is, we will have to be relooking at each valet fee individually, as we do every year, to reassess that fee and bill that for the year ahead. So that's something we can certainly look at if there is a nonprofit that needs a standard everyday type of valet. But I think the question is more geared toward those special events, and no, this would not be impacted for those.
All right, perfect. So we have another question here from Tom Boyer. We have been hit with the pandemic, property taxes. The Metro Traffic and Parking Commission changed out library garage late 2020 that cost us an additional $130,000 annually. We are already running in the red as a business. Can we see the other city data you benchmarked?
Okay. Yeah, the last part on that, certainly the answer is yes. I have a technical memo that we wrote in working with that steering committee, and Sissy, maybe what we will do is after this meeting, we can post that to that Traffic and Parking Commission page as well. And so you can see that data and see how other cities are structured. It's in a table format. It's not pages and pages of material. It's a very concise summary of what we found and how I think we compare to that. So I think that's a great idea, and certainly it's something that we can share. As to your other comments, I hear you loud and clear. We've heard those many times, and I think we will continue to consider that, whether or not this is the right time to institute this. I think will be a question we all consider very heavily going forward.
Okay, perfect. Now we have a question from Logan Standiford. Why is this fee structure based on total potential revenue loss and not actual average revenue collected per meter in Metro?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that the steering committee really pressed hard about, and we continue to think about that. So when we make that memo available, we also have our actual revenue information included in that as well, and so you can see it. And when you look at that, what you'll see is that for most meters, our revenue is about, I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 10% of the potential revenue. So, you know, our meter sits out there. I think if you look at it on a daily basis, we stand to gain if there was a car in there paying the rate that we ask, which is I think $2.50 in the downtown area. All 10 hours of the day, we'd make $42 or something like that. And so we're capturing only about 10% of that for most of our meters. It depends on where you are in the city, but it's in that ballpark. So two answers to the question. We feel like that's very low, and one reason we feel like that's low is because of issues that we have in enforcement. We know we don't enforce those meters like we should. We have 5 enforcement officers that work the entire city, and so we know that there's not a lot of incentive to keep those meters full or paid is one thing. So the other aspect to it is looking at that peer city data that we found. I think it's correct in saying nobody actually does it based on their actual revenue. It's based on the potential revenue. And we saw rates, you know, where we're at 35 and 50, graduating all the way up to 100% of our potential. We saw rates in the neighborhood of 25%. Most tend to be in that 30 to 40%, all the way up to 100%. But when you see that, you'll see that they do it any number of ways. Atlanta, for instance, does a rate per space, but also charges a fee for the length, the amount of frontage of your valet zone, and they incorporate that into the equation. Denver, for example, might be at 30% for the first 2 spaces, but anything more than that goes to 100% of the potential. And so, you know, we've taken bits and pieces and tried to work it in, bits and pieces from those peer cities and work it in for a situation that we think fits Nashville the best. But there's a number of different ways to do that. And where we landed was, in general, 35% of the potential. Let me mention here too, if you'd rather voice a question, Mr. Buchanan if you will hit your little hand button down at the bottom and virtually raise your hand. ITS is watching out for those, and we can switch over to that, and if there are anybody with a raised hand, we can unmute you and you can ask your question by phone. Dante, do we have anybody there wanting to do that?
No, we don't have any questions at the moment.
Okay. Sissy, back to you. Do you have another one?
Yes, I do. This one is from D. Patel, and it states, I appreciate the work gone into this proposal. I support a palatable solution. This doesn't seem such. How is loss of revenue calculated in front of a building that never historically had metered parking? In addition, he added actual revenue calculated per meter is approximately $571. We should work off this number.
Good question. And I think what it's alluding to is the fact, maybe in that last slide, where what we anticipate doing is looking at streets that have parking somewhere on them. If it's in, and even that is not an airtight description, because you know, our streets in Nashville, we have, especially downtown, very, very constrained right-of-ways. So in one block, you might have room and you've got some on-street parking. In the next block, you don't. In the next block, you would, except for we've signed all loading zones and that kind of thing. And so it's very difficult to have a hard and fast rule that kind of blankets all of downtown. And so that's where we'll have to get into trying to identify, you know, using the concepts in this policy, but identify actually what that fee would equate to. Again, our intent is to charge that responsibly for areas where we have lost revenue. Now, What we also don't want to do, though, and we've been faced with this in the past, is areas where maybe the parking meters were removed for some other use, say it's a loading zone or something like that, and then a year later it comes back and it's requested to be a valet zone. Well, in that case, we didn't actually remove any meters. We did that back when we made it a loading zone, and now we don't have any ability to recover that cost if we didn't physically remove a meter. So we're trying to avoid that type of a situation as well. Instead, what we're trying to do is determine where the intent would be that we had metered parking, paid on-street parking in that vicinity. It may not be exactly in front of that business where it's being requested now, but if there is the potential for that to be metered, or it has been metered in the past or something like that, then we would incorporate that as part of the equation. I know that's not a very accurate, specific answer, but it does kind of depend on exactly where we're talking about as to whether that would be applicable or not.
Okay, perfect. So it looks like we have one more question in the queue, and this one is from JT Manor. The lost revenue is based on a formula, not the actual lost revenue. Do you know the actual revenue per individual meter? Also, I think this cost is too high to place on hotels and restaurants, especially coming out of this past year.
Very good. Again, Diane, feel free to chime in if I get this wrong. We do not know the revenue coming out of each meter. I think you all are very aware that the meters, if you don't have to travel very widely to find that the meters in Nashville are kind of throwbacks to parking meters in other places. We're working on that. If nothing else, the ability to take something other than coins in the form of plastic or whatever. And so no, we still operate on a canister that our parking staff goes around, collects those coins, and those are consolidated into a larger bucket, for lack of a better term. And so once that happens, we lose the ability to track it by actual meter. We do have meter zones, and so I showed you kind of an example of that in those colored maps a minute ago, but you only saw 2 zones. We actually have, I want to say 5 or 6 zones, so we can break it down a little bit further and report that. And I think we have in that document, so you can see exactly what the revenue is coming out. And so then when you divide it out, we know how many meters are in those areas and how much revenue was collected by area. And so we can get a pretty good feel for how much is in those areas, but we can't tell you exactly to the meter. But we're working on it.
Let me mute myself here. And this question is from Michael Hayes. Was there discussion relative to overall economic impact? For example, a meter might generate 15,000, but a new development might generate 600,000 to 2 million in new tax revenue, and the loss of the meter to enable the development to occur would be well worth it.
Yeah, that's certainly a very valid point. And if not, a little bit out of the hands of the Public Works Department. I mean, certainly we take that very seriously and try to incorporate that into our considerations. But what we're trying to do is look back to the code to say, how are we going to define this? And so I would say we have not cast a very broad net in the form of looking at all of the other considerations that go in as part of this. And there are a lot, such as, the broader economic impacts to this. But what we are doing is try to get a fair valuation of the curb space and and kind of present that to our policymakers here in town, and let them grapple with some of those weightier issues. Hopefully what we're able to do is provide some technical data to inform that discussion, and do our best to kind of throw out something there that we think would be good to talk from. We've heard a lot of comments about, I think it's too high, or I think the time is not right. And all of those are completely understandable and absolutely valid. At the end of this, we will make a recommendation, and we can modify that or whatever, but that's kind of where we are on that. So I appreciate that. There are broader economic considerations there. And hopefully we've come up with something that certainly it's a lot of money for some businesses. It's more for everybody. I think everybody would pretty well acknowledge that $50 is not where we need to be. We feel like we've taken a stab at that middle ground, but that discussion will continue, I'm sure.
Okay, that was the last question in the Q&A chat box. Or here's another one. Also for Michael Hayes, would that have been the committee, Jeff?
Yeah, let me say something about the committee, because we did pick folks that we felt like had a good feel for how valet parking works in Nashville, what some of those impacts would be to businesses. They're business owners, they're in particular downtown oriented, but I don't want to give the impression that we did a big economic study and we looked at what the valuation is of very, very important businesses who have made the decision not only to come to Nashville, but to come to downtown Nashville and operate their business and everything that is involved in that. And then in particular, doing that in the year 2020. And so, I showed you earlier, we had 6 valet applications this past year. And if I can't say this for sure, but anecdotally, as I looked through those earlier this morning, I was reminded that those were generally hotels that kind of had been constructing and finished, and it was time to open, and had to do that in the midst of the pandemic and all the impacts of that. So I won't get too far afield here, but the committee, I think, is certainly aware of that argument, that these businesses are tremendous contributors, not only to the tax base in Nashville, but to its vibrancy and so forth. They know that, but we did not go and try and put numbers to that and incorporate that into the calculation.
All right, and Michael Hayes also added with council member have been involved as well.
Right. Sean Parker was the council member who helped us in that study, representing District 5. Again, I think at about the same level. Certainly, he would be aware of the impacts. I think what we asked, from him and from all of our steering committee members is to give us your thoughts on that. And I think we reached a consensus. I don't think everyone is in full agreement with where we end up on the numbers. I think if you ask any one of us, we might change something here or there. But I am comfortable where we reached, at least to this point, in terms of a draft policy to talk from.
Okay, at this time, it looks like that was the last question in the queue.
Tom Cash does have his hand raised. He has a question.
Hey, thanks, Mr. Hammond, for that presentation and all the good work that went into this. I've been looking forward to hearing what the committee decided, and like a lot of what I've heard. So when there are valet, I guess I want to get a sense of a little bit better sense of the difference between when there are metered spaces and when they're not, but there's some close by. But as part of that, let's say like a restaurant is going to open for lunch, and so they want the valet stand starting at 11. If there are meters there, they get to run until 11. Is that right? And then they like get covered when the valet stand starts working. And so, like, what happens if like somebody is there? I guess there's signage that you have to be gone by 11, or how does it work in terms of like if somebody parks at 10:30 and they're still there at 11 when they want the valet stand? Does that just get worked out, or?
Yeah, Diane, if you're on the call and able to unmute and answer that, that's a great kind of nuts and bolts day-to-day question that you would have more familiarity with.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Okay, whenever there's a valet that utilizes their zone from 11 to 2, we put signs on the parking meters to identify it as a valet zone from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. or whatever hours, Monday through Friday, or whatever days of the week they need it. That's how we handle that.
And that works. There are very few problems with valet folks being upset that people are still parked there. Or...
Currently, at this time, we only have one valet location that operates during the hours when the meters are enforced.
Gotcha. All right, thank you.
There are no new questions in the queue.
Okay. Well, again, we really appreciate your interest. You're wanting to learn about this, and we are committed to continue to answer questions and take comments as those come in. And again, we've left that contact information here if you would want to send those to us. Might be the best way to do it, but if those need to come to Councilman O'Connell, I'm sorry for this, but you're a council member, and I'm sure he would love to hear from you as well, and as well as any of the traffic and parking commissioners. Again, this will be on the agenda at the March meeting, and we anticipate we may have some of you there for that. That will be, I'm fairly certain, a virtual meeting again. You'll have this type of opportunity to comment in front of the commission as well. With that, again, we thank you for your time and your attention to this. We look forward to hearing from you if you do have additional comments, and appreciate everyone here at Metro staff and our council members, especially, including Councilman Cash, who just called in for their help with this. With that, I wish you a very good evening. Stay safe and stay warm.